The South Africa national soccer team represents South Africa in men's international soccer, and it is run by the South African Football Association, the governing body for soccer in South Africa. The team's nickname is Bafana, and South Africa's home ground is FNB Stadium, which is located in Johannesburg. The team's greatest result was winning the Africa Cup of Nations at home in 1996. The team is a member of both FIFA and Confederation of African Football. Having played their first match in 1906, they returned to the world stage in 1992, after 16 years of being banned from FIFA, and 40 years of effective suspension due to the apartheid system. South Africa became the first African nation to host the FIFA World Cup when it was granted host status for the 2010 edition. The team's Sifiwe Tshabalala was also the first player to score in this World Cup during the opening game against Mexico, which was followed by an iconic Macarena-style goal celebration from 5 South African players. Despite defeating France 2-1 in their final game of the group stage, they failed to progress from the first round of the tournament, becoming the first host nation in the history of the FIFA World Cup to exit in the group stage. Despite this, the team was ranked 20th out of 32 sides. As of the June 23, 2022, the team is ranked 12th in Africa and has moved one spot up in the world and is currently in the 68th position. History 1950s-60s, origin and early years. The origin of the African Nations Cup dates from June 1956, when the creation of the Confederation of African Football was proposed during the Third FIFA Congress in Lisbon. There were immediate plans for a continental tournament to be held and, in February 1957, the first Africa Cup of Nations was held in Khartoum, Sudan. There was no qualification for this tournament, the field being made up of the 4 founding nations of CAF. South Africa's insistence on selecting only white players for its squad due to its apartheid policy led to its disqualification, and as a consequence Ethiopia were handed a bye straight to the final. Hence only 2 matches were played, with Egypt being crowned as the first continental champion after defeating hosts Sudan in the semi-final and Ethiopia in the final. 2 years later Egypt hosted the second ANC in Cairo with the participation of the same 3 teams. Host and defending champions Egypt again won, after defeating Sudan. The field grew to include 9 teams for the third ANC in 1961 in Addis Ababa, and for the first time there was a qualification round to determine which 4 teams would play for the title. Host Ethiopia and reigning champion Egypt received automatic berths, and were joined in the Final 4 by Nigeria and Tunisia. Egypt made its 3rd consecutive final appearance, but the Ethiopia team emerged as victors, first beating Tunisia and then downing Egypt in extra time. 1960s, Ghanaian domination. In 1963, Ghana made its first appearance as it hosted the event, and won the title after beating Sudan in the final. They repeated that as they became champions 2 years later in Tunisia, equaling Egypt as 2-time winners with a squad that included only 2 returning members from the 1963 team. In 1965, the CAF introduced a rule that limited the number of overseas players in each team to 2. The rule persisted until 1982. The 1968 competition's final tournament format expanded to include 8 of the 22 teams entered in the preliminary rounds. The qualifying teams were distributed in 2 groups of 4 to play single round-robin tournaments, with the top 2 teams of each group advancing to semi-finals, a system that remained in use for the finals until 1992. The Democratic Republic of Congo won its first title, beating Ghana in the final. Starting with the 1968 tournament, the competition was regularly held every 2 years in even-numbered years. This ended with the 2012 tournament, which was followed by a tournament in 2013, and successor editions in each odd-numbered year. Ivory Coast forward Laurent Poca led the 1968 and 1970 tournaments in scoring, with 6 and 8 goals respectively, and his total of 14 goals remained the all-time record until 2008. Play was covered for television for the first time during the 1970 tournament in Sudan, as the hosts lifted the trophy after defeating Ghana, who were playing their 4th consecutive final. 1970s, a decade of champions. 6 nations won titles from 1970 to 1980, Sudan, Congo-Brazzaville, Zaire, Morocco, Ghana, and Nigeria. Zaire's second title in the 1974 edition came after facing Zambia in the final. For the only time to date in the history of the competition, the match had to be replayed as the first contest between the two sides ended in a 2-2 draw after extra time. The final was restaged 2 days later with Zaire winning 2-0. Forward Malamba Ndeye scored all 4 of Zaire's goals in these 2 matches. He was also the top scorer of the tournament with 9 goals, setting a single tournament record that remains unmatched. 3 months earlier, Zaire had become the first sub-Saharan African nation to qualify to the FIFA World Cup. Morocco won their first title in the 1976 ANC held in Ethiopia, and Ghana took its 3rd championship in 1978, becoming the first nation to win 3 titles. 1980s, Cameroonian domination. Between 1980 and 1990, Cameroon managed to reach the final of the Africa Cup 3 times in a row, winning the competition twice in 1984 and 1988 and losing once on penalties against Egypt in the 1986 edition. The other dominant team during this period was Algeria, along with their solid 1982 and decent 1986 World Cup appearances. The North African nation lost in the final against hosts Nigeria in the 1980 tournament, allowing the Super Eagles to capture their first championship. After the 1980 edition, Algeria reached the semi-finals of every edition except the 1,986 Cuban pesos until they eventually won the competition in 1990. Ghana's 4th continental title came in the 1,982 Cuban pesos tournament, where they beat host Libya in the final. The match ended in a 1-1 draw after 120 minutes, and Ghana national football team won the penalty shootout to become champions. 1990s, the return of South Africa. In 1990, the 1990 African Cup of Nations was the 17th edition of the Africa Cup of Nations, the football championship of Africa. It was hosted by Algeria. Just like in 1988, the field of 8 teams was split into 2 groups of 4. Algeria won its first championship, beating Nigeria in the final 1-0. Nigeria lost once again as they made their 3rd final appearance in 4 tournaments, this time falling to host Algeria. The 1992 Cup of Nations expanded the number of final tournament participants to 12. The teams were divided into 4 groups of 3, with the top 2 teams of each group advancing to quarter-finals. Ghanaian midfielder Abedi Pele Ayew, who scored 3 goals, was named the best player of the tournament after his contributions helped Ghana reach the final. He was, however, suspended for that match, and Ghana lost to Ivory Coast in a penalty shootout that saw each side make 11 attempts to determine the winner. Ivory Coast set a record for the competition by holding each of their opponents scoreless in the 6 matches of the final tournament. The 12-team, 3-group format was used again 2 years later, where hosts Tunisia were humiliated by their first-round elimination. Nigeria, who had just qualified to the World Cup for the first time in their history, won the tournament, beating Zambia, who a year before had been struck by disaster when most of their national squad died in a plane crash while traveling to play a 1994 World Cup qualification match. Nigerian forward Rashidi Yekini, who had led the 1992 tournament with 4 goals, repeated as the top scorer with 5 goals. South Africa hosted the 20th ACN competition in 1996, marking its first ever appearance after a decades-long ban was lifted with the end of apartheid in the country, which had been followed by a failed attempt to qualify in 1994. The number of final round participants in 1996 was expanded to 16, split into 4 groups. However, the actual number of teams playing in the final was only 15, because Nigeria withdrew from the tournament at the final moment for political reasons. Bafana won their first title on home soil, defeating Tunisia in the final. The South Africans would reach the final again 2 years later in Burkina Faso, but were unable to defend their title, losing to Egypt, who claimed their 4th cup. 2000s, Egypt's unprecedented treble. The 2000 edition was hosted jointly by Ghana and Nigeria, who replaced the originally designated host Zimbabwe. Following a 2-2 draw after extra time in the final, Cameroon defeated Nigeria on penalty kicks. In 2002, Cameroon's indomitable Lions won the 2nd consecutive title. This was the first repeat since Ghana had done it in the 1960s and after Egypt had done it before in 1957 and 1959. The Cameroonians beat first-time finalists Senegal, who also debuted in the World Cup later that year, via penalty kicks. Both finalists were eliminated in the quarter-finals 2 years later in Tunisia, where the hosts won their first title, beating Morocco 2-1 in the final. The 2006 tournament was also won by the hosts, Egypt, who reached a continental record 5th title. Ahead of the 2008 Africa Cup of Nations, several European clubs called for a rethink of the tournament's schedule. Given that it takes place during the European season, players who are involved miss several matches for their clubs. In January 2008, FIFA President Sepp Blatter announced that he wanted the tournament to be held in either June or July by 2016, to fit in the international calendar, although this would preclude many countries in Central and West Africa from hosting the competition. The 2008 tournament was hosted by Ghana, and saw Egypt retain the trophy, winning its record-extending 6th tournament by defeating Cameroon 1-0 in the final. 2010s, switch to odd years. Egypt set a new record in the 2010 tournament by winning its 3rd consecutive title in an unprecedented achievement on the African level after defeating Ghana 1-0 in the final, retaining the gold-plated cup indefinitely and extending its record to 7 continental titles. Egypt became the first African nation to win 3 consecutive cups and joined Mexico, Argentina, and Iran, who also won their Continent Cup 3 times in a row. On January 31, 2010, Egypt set a new African record, not being defeated for 19 consecutive Cup of Nations matches, since a 2-1 loss against Algeria in Tunisia in 2004, and a record 9 consecutive win streak. In May 2010, it was announced that the tournament would be moved to odd-numbered years from 2013 in order to prevent the tournament from taking place in the same year as the World Cup. It also meant there were 2 tournaments within 12 months in January 2012 and January 2013. The change of FIFA Confederations Cup from a biennial to a quadrennial tournament, and the switching of the Africa Cup of Nations from even to odd number years, meant that some previous Africa Cup of Nations champions such as Egypt, Zambia, and Ivory Coast were deprived from participating in the Confederations Cup tournament. In 2011, Morocco won the bid to host the 2015 edition, and Libya won the right to host the 2013 tournament, but the 2011 Libyan civil war prompted Libya and South Africa to trade years, with South Africa hosting in 2013 and Libya hosting in 2017. Ongoing fighting in Libya ultimately prompted CAF to move the 2017 tournament to Gabon. In 2012, Zambia won the final after a penalty shootout against Ivory Coast. This drew increased media attention since the match took place in Gabon, only a few hundred meters from the crash site of the 1993 air disaster of their national team. The 2013 tournament was won by Nigeria, beating first-time finalists Burkina Faso. In 2014-15, the West African Ebola virus epidemic disrupted the tournament. All football activities in Liberia were suspended, and the Antoinette Tubman Stadium in Monrovia was converted into an Ebola treatment unit. The 2015 Africa Cup of Nations was scheduled to be held in Morocco, but they refused to hold the tournament on the allotted dates due to concerns of the Ebola outbreak, so it was moved to Equatorial Guinea. In July 2016, Total secured the rights to an 8-year sponsorship package to support 10 of CAF's principal competitions. This began with the 2017 Africa Cup of Nations in Gabon, which was renamed the Total Africa Cup of Nations. Since 2019, tournament expansion. Under Ahmed Ahmed's presidency, there were discussions regarding further changes to the Africa Cup of Nations. In July 2017, 2 changes were proposed, switching the timing of the competition from January to the Northern Hemisphere summer and expanding from 16 to 24 teams. On July 20, 2017, the CAF Executive Commission approved the propositions at a meeting in Rabat, Morocco. Algeria won the African Cup of Nations 2019, achieving a 1-0 victory against Senegal in the final. The title was Algeria's second ever and first since 1990. Nigeria came third after beating Tunisia 1-0 in their third-place decider match. The prize money awarded to the 2019 Africa Cup of Nations winner amounted to $4.5 million, while runners-up Senegal got $2.50 million. Match days 3 and 4 of the 2021 Africa Cup of Nations qualifiers, which was slated from 25 to March 30, 2020, were postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The 2021 Africa Cup of Nations tournament, hosted by Cameroon, and was postponed to 2022 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Confederation of African Football increased the cash prize for the winner from $4.5 million to $5 million for 2021 Africa Cup of Nations, while the second-best team will get $2.75 million. Senegal won the tournament for the first time after beating Egypt on penalties in the final. Format. Since the 1962 edition, this competition has been held in 2 phases, a qualification phase and a final tournament. The host country of the final tournament is automatically qualified, and in the first editions the defending champion was also qualified for the following tournament. Qualifying. The qualification phase has evolved over time according to the increasing number of nations affiliated to the Confederation of African Football. It was set up from 1962, during the first 2 editions of the Africa Cup of Nations. The founding nations of the CAF participated in the final tournament, namely Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. In 1962, new nations were affiliated and forced CAF to set up a qualifying phase for the final tournament in the form of knockout matches. This system was used until the 1992 edition, when the organization of the qualifying phase became closer to that of the UEFA European Championship, with qualifying groups of 4 to 7 teams depending on the editions, where each selection plays a round-trip opposition against each of its opponents, the qualified country being decided according to its classification within its group. Final phase. Only the hosts received an automatic qualification spot, with the other 23 teams qualifying through a qualification tournament. At the finals, the 24 teams were drawn into 6 groups of 4 teams each. The teams in each group played a single round robin. After the group stage, the top 2 teams and the 4 best third-placed teams advanced to the round of 16. The winners advanced to the quarter-finals. The winners of the quarter-finals advanced to the semi-finals. The losers of the semi-finals played in a third-place playoff, while winners of the semi-finals played in the final. Trophy and medals. Throughout the history of the Africa Cup of Nations, 3 trophies have been awarded to the winners of the competition. The original trophy, made of silver, was the Abdulaziz Abdallah Salem Trophy, named after the first CAF president, Egyptian Abdulaziz Abdallah Salem. As the first winner of 3 Africa Cup of Nations tournaments, Ghana obtained the right to permanently hold the trophy in 1978. The second trophy was awarded from 1980 to 2000, and was named Trophy of African Unity or African Unity Cup. It was given to CAF by the Supreme Council for Sports in Africa prior to the 1980 tournament, and it was a cylindrical piece with the Olympic rings over a map of the continent engraved on it. It sat on a squared base and had stylized triangular handles. Cameroon won the Unity Cup indefinitely after they became 3-time champions in 2000. In 2001, the third trophy was revealed, a gold-plated cup designed and made in Italy. Cameroon, permanent holders of the previous trophy, were the first nation to be awarded the new trophy after they won the 2002 edition. Egypt won the gold-plated cup indefinitely after they became 3-time champions in 2010. Unlike previous winners who would have then taken the trophy home, Egypt were presented with a special full-size replica that they were allowed to keep. The winner of each edition receives a replica whose dimensions are equal to that of the original trophy. CAF give 30 gold medals to the winning team, 30 silver medals to the runners-up, 30 bronze medals to the team ranked third and 30 diplomas to the team ranked fourth in the final tournament. Results. Notes. Summary. Years shown in bold indicate that the country also hosted that tournament. 1 as United Arab Republic, 2 as Congo-Kinshasa, 3 as Zaire. All-time record. Champions by region. Consecutive championships. Teams that have won the Africa Cup of Nations consecutively and have become 2-time champions or 3-time champions. Bold indicate tournament hosts. Records and statistics.